Nat Geo's new limited series, The Hot Zone, tells a terrifying true story that's almost too horrible to believe. I'm Zach Laws of Gold Derby, and joining me now are Brian Peterson and Kelly Souders. They are two of the creators of this new series. Brian and Kelly, tell us about, when you first heard about this story, which is about a potential Ebola outbreak in the United States. What did you think when you first heard about this?
Well, we were only introduced to it when we got the book. So our agent had slipped us the book, and we read the book. And just off of reading the book, obviously we were terrified too. It's Richard Preston created quite a page turner. So when you read the story that really pops out, obviously, is the Nancy Jacks and Jerry Jacks story. So before we'd sort of met with anybody or talked to anybody, that's what we globbed onto. Obviously, a woman in the military in 1989 was of particular interest to us. And so we developed a pitch and went in and met the producers for the first time on the project. We had met with Linda Oakes a year earlier about a different project and loved her energy and her passion. And we went in and sort of told them what we would focus on. And that's how we got sucked in, because it was such a great story.
It was really the psychological aspects of the of the project, looking into the internal workings of each person's mind and each character, really, in the story about how they handled the situation, that really gripped us at the beginning too.
Now, this project's been in development for a long time. Ridley Scott was trying to make it as a movie for a while. Now it's, of course, a limited series. So in terms of, adapting the book into 6 episodes, you mentioned the aspect of, the doctor who's played by Juliana Margulies and that really catching you. What were some other things that, you needed to, what were some alterations, some changes? How did you adapt this book into a show?
Well, it's a little bit what Brian was saying about the psychology of the characters. That once we sat down with Jeff Vintar, was the other writer. The three of us worked on this series together really closely. But that we kind of started to think, okay, we get 6 whole hours to do this. It's not a feature. So we know there was a big feature past in it, but we didn't really look at all, because we knew that we were going to be delving into things so much more in depth. And we really looked at each character, and in thinking about what would it be like if you sniffed what is Ebola and you didn't know it until it was too late. Like, what would you do? What are kind of the emotions you would go through? What would you do to first hide it, deny it, or face it? And how would you pull people in? How would you push it? We really just sort of talked about each character as if it was ourselves, and tried to put ourselves in their shoes. And from that, it really kind of took on a life of its own.
And there really, there really is no antagonist in the show other than Ebola. And what we loved was when you read the book, you would get to these passages and you would go, wait a minute, what are you thinking? Like, regardless of the character, you'd get to a point where you're like, no way, nobody would do this. And then in the next chapter, Preston wrote so beautifully that you're like, oh, I get it now. You were actually, and then you would backfill what was going on. So what we tried to do is each episode, even though clearly Nancy Jacks and Jerry Jacks are kind of the central focus of our show, we try to carve out each episode in a way that you really get into the psyche a little bit more of a different character that you previously didn't understand fully.
Right. And of course, since this is based on a true story, there are real people who were involved in it. Did you talk at all to some of the real people like Dr. Nancy Jacks while you were writing it?
Yeah, and Nancy and Jerry are both veterinarians, and so they have a very sort of unique perspective on what they had to deal with in 1989 Reston. So we talked with them. We talked with Peter Darling. We spoke with Richard Preston, who's so engulfed in the details of this. We talked to him a lot and about every single episode, and it was little pieces, in talking to them, that they would drop. In fact, Peter Jarling we were really stuck in this one scene because we had to try to come up with a reason why everyone was a little slow to totally believe that this is Ebola for dramatic purposes. And he gave us a piece of information that wasn't actually even in the book, that made us go, oh my God, thank God. We've been like circling the scene for weeks, pulling at our, trying to come up with something that's believable. And he's like, oh yeah, well, by the way, you know, we were all expecting to get samples of a different disease that day. And we talked to them and they were sending over samples of something that we thought was SHF. And so like, it was just like a gift getting dropped through the receiver of the phone. And suddenly the scene was a lot easier to finagle.
And we also had a lot of technical advisors. We had a couple scientists, Michael Smith, who is Nancy and Jerry's nephew, actually, who is an advisor on the show. And then we had a person on the ground also in Toronto working with everybody, as well as an African cultural advisor.
And a really wonderful guy in Africa who helped us with the languages and some of the customs there.
Not to mention at Geo's amazing research department. So we had so much support in trying to bring as much authenticity as possible to the project.
Right. In terms of the medical jargon and things like that, one of the things I really liked about this show is that you do a really good job of making this all palatable to an audience through dialogue and things like that. Can you just talk a bit about, I guess, boiling that down, simplifying it, or I mean, how did you make this into dialogue that a person could say that could also be, easily interpreted by an audience?
It was kind of like a multi-filtration system of water. Like we had the first level that we wrote, and then we ran it by Preston, and then we ran it by Michael Smith, and then Nat Geo. And so what's great, in a process like this, we also have partners at the studio and the producers. So they have fresh eyes every time we write a draft. And then it gets boiled down to on set, and the actor, Juliana was amazing, as was Topher Grace. But there are cases where they're like, yeah, no.
I can't say that.
They're like, nobody would say this in this way. And so like, I think as a team effort, it kind of filtered out to be what it ended up on screen.
And what's great is, I mean, on this project in particular, I mean, we've been very blessed in the last 20 years to work with really amazing people. But on this one in particular, like every single aspect, like Brian's saying, our advisors, Richard Preston, the studio, the network, the actors, all of them are people that we have either trusted because we've been spending years with them, or like Juliana and Topher, who we didn't know and hadn't worked with previously. But on day one, you look at them, you watch them, you understand their skill set, and you immediately realize that they know their characters and they know what people can like stomach as far as like 8 words strung together that nobody understands. And so we were just lucky to have partners that by the time it really reached screen, hopefully you kind of a little bit of a tease of like words and scientific aspects that you don't understand, but it's just like kind of exciting and makes it feel really realistic. But at the same time, walk away going, I didn't get what happened.
And for all the scientists and the military people out there who will be watching this, almost to a point, if there's something that doesn't feel real, it's been a conversation and has been particularly decided because of the drama and the narrative. And just the ease of understanding for the bulk of the audience, that was kind of a conscious decision in most cases.
Yeah, I spoke to Juliana about a week ago, and of course she was on this and ER and The Good Wife, and she said, in terms of what is harder to speak, medical jargon or legal jargon, medical jargon is by far the most difficult thing to sell. Speaking of which, Juliana, what made her, other than, of course, her time on ER and having already played a doctor, what made her right for this part?
Well, I think Nancy's, and it's why we were drawn to her in the book so much, is that, she's a mother. She's she's knee deep in science. She goes into a lab that has, deadly pathogens every day, and she's in the military, and she's not just like a private in the military. She's a lieutenant colonel by this point. So she's multifaceted. She has to be strong. At the same time, you want to have an emotional connection to her. So she needs to have some warmth, and all of that's a package that isn't easy to find. But when her name was first brought up to us, like immediately we felt like, wow, Nancy's character we could trust her in Juliana's hands and never look back, because she just inherently, and with her skill set as an actress, brings all of that in, every second on screen.
You mentioned the fact that one of the things that interested you guys was, about this being about a woman in the military in 1989, and there is this kind of, at times overt and at times subtle, sexism that she encounters all the time. Can you talk a bit about that aspect of the show?
Well, one of the things that was really interesting about developing this is, it's had many incarnations, but right when we were pitching this and developing it was 2016, 2015, 2016, 2017. And so that point was really relevant at the time and still is because of the pre-election. And so I think, it had a poignancy that has played out in really interesting ways as we've been shooting the show, as we've been going through post, and current events have been playing out as they have. It almost gets more relevant, strangely.
Sadly.
But
I think that was some, I think, looking just back to 1989, obviously, I mean, we were both alive, very, very young, but we were very aware of, women's lib, had just started not that long before, and even though there were a lot of women in the workforce, the pay is still different, and this is the case today. So it was something that I think we both had a passion for, but we didn't want to hit over the head with, because I think Nancy Jax stands on her own, but at the same time, it definitely was in the workforce, in the military, and just in American culture at the time. So we wanted to treat it in a very respectful way, but certainly let it boil to the surface at different times in the series.
And I think it was interesting, we both had really strong mothers, and so I think from especially being a boy at the time, I didn't really realize the level of sexism until there's moments in the show, hopefully, that we dramatize, that you're going along and then it just hits you in the face in this weird way that kind of blindsides you. And it's not as overt as sometimes it's portrayed on screen. So we were trying to find that balance of the bizarre ways that, it comes in that you're not expecting.
Right. Another thing that sadly is still relevant 30 years later is the fact that, there's a lot of people who doubt scientists when they try to tell us something is bound to happen. Obviously we see that today in terms of climate change and climate deniers. Can you just talk a bit about, was that something that you guys were keen to lace in there as well? Just kind of, this balance, this dynamic between people who doubt scientists and people who actually have the knowledge to back up what they're saying.
We didn't really tackle that head on in the show, but the facts of the show, and that, as we learned that a lot of these diseases are emerging because those habitats of the animals that once had the diseases, in remote areas that were far away from people, those animals and the diseases are now encroaching on human habitats because we killed off theirs. These are just facts. That word is up for grabs these days, but they're just facts. And so we tried to just portray what really has been the case and what is fairly provable.
And I think also, one thing that the show did was try to bring a lot of authenticity to the scientific aspects, and that went across the board, from the costumes, the incredible sets that we have, the amazing props that we have. We had some insanely talented people who I think just, lucky for us, bought into making this thing as authentic as it possibly could be. And when you were standing on the sets, you really couldn't tell the difference between being in the real UCM of 1989, or what I imagine it was, and the fact that we had recreated it in this big warehouse space. So I think when you see the characters sort of go through the different, millions of little components that it takes, and little, microscopic moves that it takes to find that they're dealing with Ebola. If some armchair quarterback is watching that going, oh yeah, I could do that, and I don't believe them, then what do you say to that? There's no way that you can't look at this and think, wow, these are real professionals who really know what they're doing, and we should, sort of back off and listen to them.
Yeah, you mentioned all that little detail. I particularly like that scene in the first episode where she's taking the young cadet down to the hot zone for the first time, and Reminded me a lot of that scene in Silence of the Lambs where Clarice meets Hannibal Lecter for the first time, and you're just increasingly getting more frightened of like what's going to be behind the door when they finally get there. And it's rather shocking to see how mundane it looks, where where we keep all of these like horrifyingly dangerous diseases.
Right.
Yeah. Uh,
I think I wanted to share. Oh, I
No,
was
go
just
ahead.
gonna.
No.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that was part of the book that we loved so much, was the description of going into these rooms, because to us it's like I might as well. I mean, we always talked about it. It's like being on Mars to the average person, and certainly to us. So we wanted to certainly bring the audience through that, because I think that was probably my most favorite pages in the entire book,
Mm-hmm.
of which there were many.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
no. Well, it's certainly terrifying to watch, but also oddly entertaining, which is no small compliment. Brian and Kelly, thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on the show.
Thank you so much.
It's nice to talk to you.
Welcome. Thanks, same here. And thanks to all of you at home for watching. Make sure you hit the subscribe button below, and make sure you visit us at goldderby.com for all the latest award show news and to make your own predictions. Thanks so much.